All of your good karma is finally paying off. You just top-decked your Soul Ring. That means you can play your commander again, and your opponents just emptied their hands trying to get rid of it last turn. So you tap your command tower, slap your Soul Ring on the table with a smug grin. Your opponents groan. Great, here comes Alayla again. You tap your Watery Grave, Hallowed Fountain, Inventor's Fair, Reliquary Tower, Soul Ring, and... Wait, shoot! You meant to tap the Reliquary Tower to cast the Soul Ring. You tapped wrong. No takesies backsies, the player across from you says, wagging their finger at you. Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. This week, our lesson from cEDH is all about mana pips, signaling and how to tap for mana. Which, as I say it out loud, sounds obscenely boring. But trust me, these are important skills. And the difference between what an experienced player can do versus what an experienced one can do, even with just tapping mana, can lead to significantly different outcomes in games. By the end of this episode, I'd like to make it easier for you to decide how to tap your mana sources to cast your spells. Before we start though, I just wanted to say thanks for joining us today. If you like the episodes we're doing, you can give us a like or a subscribe, where it really makes a difference for YouTube's own heuristic and the algorithm. But let's get started. I want to start with a very basic scenario today. It's turn 2, and you just top-decked a Soul Ring. You can tap either your island or a plains to cast it. And assuming that you've got nothing to do with the Soul Ring's mana, there's a big difference between what a 2 and a blue shows your opponents versus 2 and a white. Without access to blue mana, for example, it's unlikely that you'll be able to draw cards or cast counterspells. And without access to white, your instant speed removal for permanents is going to be significantly less threatening. Now let's change up that scenario. Let's assume that instead of controlling an island on a plains, you control a command tower on a plains. In this scenario, leaving the command tower untapped and tapping the plains for your Soul Ring mana means you are potentially representing 2 and a blue or 2 and a white at the same time. This will be our first heuristic. You generally want to tap in such a way that you preserve access to the most of your colors of mana. And obviously, you don't want to waste mana if you can help it. Mana burn isn't a thing anymore, but if you need to cast a spell that costs 1 and a white, you probably don't want to tap your Soul Ring for 2 when you're only going to use 1 of it that turn. There are obviously going to be exceptions to these rules. Obviously, what you have in your hand matters. If your interaction all costs a single colored mana and has no generic mana cost, it's much more important to preserve access to your colors than it necessarily is to be mana efficient. But what you want your opponents to think you have in hand matters as well. Let's tweak the scenario again. Let's change it so that instead we have an island and a Flooded Strand. Flooded Strand is one of the original Onslaught fetch lands, and it can be tapped and sacrificed at the cost of a single life to get any island or any plains from your library onto the battlefield. If we assume that our deck is a simple Azorius deck, Flooded Strand represents an island or a plains, whichever we happen to need at that point. It's not all that different from Hengate Pathway, which is the blue-white MDFC from Kaldheim, but the obvious difference being that we don't need to decide which land we need until the last possible second. We can tap and sacrifice Flooded Strand at instant speed to get access to exactly the colors of mana we need. And yes, I meant colors to be plural there. Because fetch lands don't say basic island or basic plains, you can grab a Hallowed Fountain with Flooded Strand, meaning your fetch land is a lot more like a command tower with extra steps. Where this gets even more interesting is when you add additional colors to the deck. Let's assume that we're in Bant instead of just Azorius. That Flooded Strand can now fetch up any of Hallowed Fountain, Breeding Pool, or Temple Garden. Your opponents don't know which land you're going to fetch until you do it. They may make their assumptions, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about later, but you're going to tap your island in this case to cast your Soul Ring, as your Flooded Strand represents 2 colors from among white, blue, or green. When you start to get into the upper echelons of mana bases, when you have fetches, shocks, ABUR dual lands, a Flooded Strand may represent any of Hallowed Fountain, Breeding Pool, Temple Garden, Tundra, Tropical Island, or Savannah. You could wait until the end step before your turn to fetch out a Temple Garden to fix your mana, letting it come into play tap to save yourself 2 life, or respond to an opponent who's trying to cast a Heuristic Study by fetching up a Tropical Island and casting Swan Song to stop them from developing their own draw engine. This leads to another point in our heuristic. Fetch lands are potentially very flexible in what mana they represent, and waiting to crack them until the last possible second is generally optimal. You deny your opponents the knowledge of what colors of mana you will have access to, and you do lose out on a lot of the flexibility once the fetch land has been cracked and you've searched up a typed land to put into play. Just be on your guard if you're getting signals that somebody's holding up mana for something like an opposition agent or Aven Mind Sensor. More on that in another episode. So far, our heuristic is relatively simple. Try to keep open your most flexible sources of mana as long as possible. But it's time to move beyond lands. Let's talk about another form of reusable mana in the form of mana dorks. These are your Llanowar Elves, your Birds of Paradise, and your Noble Hierarchs. You're probably familiar with most of these, and they represent an interesting choice in our heuristic. Let's set up a new example, and we'll assume we've missed our land drop on turn 2. So all we have access to is a Forest and a Llanowar Elves. We don't have any additional lands, and we want to cast the Soul Ring, which we just drew. In general, your heuristic with mana dorks is to tap them before you tap your lands, as you really want to use your most fragile mana sources as many times as possible before you lose them. Creatures are incredibly fragile in Commander, mana dorks particularly so, as they tend to die incidentally to a stiff breeze. Pyroclasms wipes them out, toxic deluges kill them off for a single life, and they'll go down like everything else to a Wrath of God. The reason why you generally tap mana dorks first is that you've sunk mana into casting them, and they return that mana every single time you tap them for mana later on. If you were to take turn 1 to cast a Llanowar Elves, and then never get a chance to tap it for mana, well, a 1/1 with no text on it is generally not worth a card or a game action. Mana dorks represent fragile sources of mana, and the more times you can draw mana from them before they're lost, the better your return on investment. So to modify our heuristic, fragile mana sources should generally be tapped before safe mana sources, such as lands. Usually making use of your fragile mana sources as efficiently as possible would take priority over preserving access to colors or types of mana, so Birds of Paradise should probably get tapped relatively early in your decision making. Certain scenarios do flip this, of course. If your commander is something like Edric, Spymaster of Trest, or Timna the Weaver, it may be more valuable to attack an opponent who is open and get a card draw, as the game action of drawing a card is generally worth more than a single mana. After considering mana dorks, we should also consider mana rocks. Mana rocks are more fragile than lands, though in most cases they're going to be hardier than mana dorks. They won't get blown up incidentally by a Wrath, but they can easily be wiped out by a Vandal Blast, bounced by a Cyclonic Rift, or shut off with a Stony Silence. Since they're more fragile than lands, it's also generally correct to tap them for mana before you tap your lands, for the same reason you want to tap your dorks before your lands. Every time you tap that rock for mana, you're getting another return on your mana investment and game action from earlier in the game. A turn 1 Soul Ring tapped every turn for mana over the course of a game that went for 5 turns provided you 10 additional mana. Dark Ritual is considered to be an amazing spell in Eternal formats because it turns 1 mana into 3. Turning 1 mana into 10 is mind-numbingly good. Thus, you're incentivized to tap your mana rocks early and often. Obviously, there are some caveats here. If you control a Mox Diamond and a Forest, it's probably correct to tap the Forest for mana first, unless you're unusually confident that an opponent plans to destroy your Mox, as you're more likely to be able to use your Mox to tap for a color of mana, which can interact with an opponent's attempts to destroy it than a basic Forest can. Mox Amber is probably even more fragile than most other mana rocks, as it only taps for mana if you control a legendary creature, meaning that it could be turned off if you happen to lose your commander or other legendary creatures, in addition to being blown up on its own, so I would be much more willing to tap a Mox Amber before any one of my other mana rocks. On the other hand, we should talk a little bit about rituals as well. Remember that rituals are one-shot boosts of mana named after Dark Ritual. After you use them, you lose access to them forever. Unlike mana dorks or mana rocks, which the game's actions and resource economy reward you the more that you activate, ritual mana is lost after you've activated it once. Treasures are the go-to example in modern design. A treasure represents an additional source of mana of any color, but you have to tap and sacrifice the treasure in order to make use of that mana. Treasures in particular not only provide access to any color of mana that you need, remember our previous heuristic, preserve your access to colors of mana, they're also very fragile as artifact tokens. And you may remember we've already identified that it's beneficial to use your most fragile mana sources as many times as possible before you lose them. But we have to add another heuristic to our list. Reserve your ritual mana for last. If you have the option to tap a basic forest for mana to cast a Soul Ring, or a treasure token, it's usually correct to tap the land to save the treasure token. Treasure tokens are probably the most extreme example, but you can apply the same thought process to brown rituals like Mana Vault and Grim Monolith, powerful mana rocks which tap for a burst of mana and then require that you pump mana back into them to untap them on a later turn. If you do decide to use your ritual mana, you generally want to do so when it will provide you with a significant advantage. If you watch cEDH players, for example, you can see some explosive starts, where a player drops a land, Mana Crypt, then taps for 3 mana to play a Soul Ring and an Arcane Signet, meaning that they untap on turn 2 with at least 4 mana, even if they didn't hit any other land drops. Remember what we said before about mana rocks? The more times you get to tap them for mana, the better your return on investment. Same thing applies to other value engines. The more times they trigger or provide you other meaningful game actions, the greater your return on investment. So a better heuristic for ritual mana may be reserve your ritual mana for when you can generate an explosive advantage in game actions or in future potential game actions. Even if you have to crack a few treasures to resolve a powerful value engine like Seedborn Muse or Wandering Archaic or Consecrated Sphinx, it can be really powerful to do so early. So to review, our basic heuristics are: number 1, tap your vulnerable mana sources like Mana Dorks and then Mana Rocks before you tap your lands, because the more times you get to use them, the better your return on investment. Number 2, tap your lands second, prioritizing keeping access to more colors of mana for as long as possible, with fetch lands generally being the last lands you want to activate, since the flexibility they represent goes way down once you've activated them. Number 3, reserve your mana rituals for last, or for when you can generate an explosive advantage in game actions or future game actions. Now, there is still a ton to cover here. I've alluded several times throughout this episode to reasons why you'd want access to more colors of mana, and I think that's actually going to be our next episode. We've only scratched the surface for when it's right to deviate from these heuristics as well. What about you? What are the heuristics you make use of when it comes to Commander gameplay? It doesn't have to be about tapping for mana. And important follow-up question, when are the right times to deviate from those heuristics? Let us know. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG. You can email us, gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com, or you can leave us a comment on YouTube, where we're Gemstone Mine Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode or one of our other episodes, you can subscribe and ring the bell to get alerts for when our new episodes go live. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.